The cameras flashed, their blinding lights bouncing off the polished floor. Reporters crowded in, shoving microphones forward, eager to capture every word. She stood at the center of it all, poised, elegant, untouchable. The same woman he once left behind. The same woman he thought would never move on. Now, she was a household name, and he was just another face in the crowd, watching from the shadows. He never thought this day would come. Not like this. Not with her standing there, confident, radiant, the weight of his past mistakes pressing against his chest like a boulder. The last time he saw her, she was different, quiet, unsure, desperate for him to stay. But he didn't. He walked away, convinced she'd never make it without him. Now the whole world knew her name. He didn't even recognize her at first. Not until he heard the voice. That voice. The same one that used to beg him to see her worth. The same one that once cracked under heartbreak. But tonight, it was different. Steady. Sure. She spoke with the ease of someone who had nothing left to prove. The crowd hung on to her every word. She was talking about her journey, how she built herself from the ground up, how she refused to let anyone define her future. They cheered for her, celebrated her, and he just stood there, invisible, like he didn't exist. He told himself he didn't care, that he was just curious, but his fingers curled into fists, his pulse hammering against his skin. Because deep down, he knew the truth. He lost her, and now she was everything he never believed she could be. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He was the one who had it all, the connections, the success, the confidence. He was the one who walked away without looking back, certain she'd always be there, waiting. But life had a way of flipping the script. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message. You see her? Bet you didn't expect that. He swallowed hard. Of course, they knew. Everyone did. Social media had been flooded with her name for weeks, her rise, her success, her story of resilience. And now, standing here, watching her in real time, he felt something he never thought he would. Regret. The event was exclusive, filled with the biggest names, but somehow he felt like an outsider, like he didn't belong. Because when she looked over the crowd, her gaze sweeping past familiar faces, she didn't even hesitate. Didn't even pause. She didn't see him at all. Or maybe she did. Maybe she just didn't care. He turned away before he could find out, before the weight of his own choices crushed him completely. But as he walked through the doors, away from the spotlight, away from her, one thought clawed at him, refusing to let go. What if she had never been the one who needed him? What if, all this time, he had been the one who needed her? That was all he could think about as he stepped outside, the cool night air doing nothing to ease the weight pressing down on him. The city was alive, cars passing, people laughing, music spilling out from the venue behind him, but it all felt distant, like he was standing in a world that no longer belonged to him. He had spent years believing she would always be there, that no matter what he did, no matter how far he distanced himself, she would never truly move on. That was the way it always worked, wasn't it? He left. She waited. He lived his life, certain she'd never catch up. But tonight proved him wrong. His phone buzzed again, but he didn't check it. He already knew what the messages would say. People from his past, old friends, even those who had nothing to do with him anymore, they had all seen it, just like he had. They had seen her. He started walking, not even sure where he was going. He just knew he needed to get away from that place, from the image of her standing in front of flashing cameras, like she was born for it. How had this happened? How had she gone from the girl who used to cry in his arms to this, a name that carried weight, a presence that demanded attention? He thought back to the last time he had seen her, really seen her. It had been a cold night, just like this one. She had stood in the doorway, her eyes searching his face, looking for something, anything that would make him stay. He remembered the way she had reached for him, fingers brushing against his sleeve, her voice small but steady. "You don't have to do this." And he had laughed. Not because it was funny, but because to him it had been ridiculous. "Come on, you'll be fine." We both know this was never going to last. He could still see the way her face fell, how she had pressed her lips together like she was trying to keep herself from breaking. "What if you're wrong?" she had asked, and he had shrugged, already halfway out the door. He hadn't looked back. Now he wished he had. Because she had been right. He was wrong. The streets blurred past him as he walked, hands shoved deep in his pockets. It wasn't just that she had moved on. It was how completely she had done it. She hadn't just rebuilt herself, she had become something else entirely. Someone he didn't recognize. Someone who didn't need him. That was the part that cut the deepest. He knew he should feel happy for her, or at the very least, indifferent. That's what he had always told himself. What she did after him wasn't his concern. But now that it was real, now that she was standing in front of the world like she had never once been the girl he left behind, he couldn't ignore the knot tightening in his chest. She had done what he never thought she could. And he hated how much that mattered to him. His phone buzzed again, and this time he glanced at it. A name he hadn't seen in a long time. "We need to talk. Call me." He stared at the message, heart pounding, because the person who sent it was the last person he ever expected to reach out. And if they were messaging him now, it meant something was about to change. His fingers hovered over the screen, hesitation pressing down on him. He hadn't spoken to this person in years. Not since everything fell apart. Not since he walked away from that life and convinced himself he'd never have to look back. But now, after seeing her, after feeling the weight of everything he tried to ignore for so long, he knew this message wasn't random. He glanced around, the city lights flickering against the dark sky. His heart was still racing from what he had just witnessed inside the applause, the flashing cameras, the way she carried herself like she had never once been the girl he left behind. He took a slow breath, and then, before he could talk himself out of it, he pressed the call button. The phone barely rang before the voice on the other end answered. "Took you long enough." The words were sharp, but there was something else beneath them. Something he couldn't place. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice steady even though his pulse was anything but. A pause. "You saw her, didn't you?" His jaw clenched. Of course, that was what this was about. Everyone had seen her. She was everywhere. He exhaled, dragging a hand down his face. "Yeah, I saw her." Another pause, longer this time. Then, the voice lowered. "Then you know she's not the same." A chill crept up his spine. It wasn't just the words, it was the way they were said. Like there was more to this than just some old ex, moving on and making a name for herself. He turned away from the street, stepping into the shadows of a nearby alley. "What are you trying to say?" The voice on the other end hesitated, as if choosing the next words carefully. "She's different now. And not just because of the money. Not just because of the fame." Something in his chest tightened. He thought about the way she had looked right past him tonight, as if he didn't exist. The way she stood there, commanding the room in a way he had never seen before. "What happened to her?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The person on the other end let out a slow breath. "That's what I've been trying to figure out." A beat of silence passed between them. The weight of it settled deep in his bones. He didn't know why, but suddenly, it felt like this wasn't just about his own guilt. This wasn't just about regret. Something bigger was at play. And whether he wanted to or not, he was already in too deep. He gripped the phone tighter, his pulse hammering against his skin. The city noise faded into a dull hum around him. He didn't want to ask the next question, but he knew he had to. "What exactly do you mean by that?" The silence on the other end stretched too long, making his chest tighten. Then finally, the voice came back, quieter this time. "She's not just different. She's unrecognizable. I don't mean the way she looks or the way she talks. I mean something's off. His stomach twisted. He wanted to brush it off, to tell himself this was just someone reading too much into things. But the uneasy feeling that had been sitting in his gut since the moment he saw her wouldn't go away. Tell me everything. Another pause. A sigh. Then, the voice spoke again, words careful, deliberate. She doesn't talk to anyone from before. Not a single person. No friends, no family. It's like she erased everything that existed before she became who she is now. And anyone who tries to reach out, it's like they don't exist to her. His mind raced. He hadn't tried contacting her, not even once. He always figured it was better that way, easier for both of them. But now, hearing this, something inside him twisted. Maybe she just wants to forget the past, he muttered, but the words felt hollow even as he said them. The voice on the other end didn't let up. That's what I thought too, until I started looking into it. A chill ran through him. Looking into what? A breath. The people who used to know her. Some of them, they don't just disappear from her life. They disappear completely. His grip tightened on the phone. What are you saying? I'm saying no one knows where they went. No social media. No job records. No connections. It's like they never existed. His heart pounded. This wasn't possible. It didn't make sense. He tried to shove it aside, to remind himself that people move on, that fame changes things. But deep down, something wasn't sitting right. He thought back to the way she had looked at the event. Not just confident, not just powerful, but untouchable. Like she wasn't just choosing not to acknowledge her past. Like she had become something completely separate from it. The voice on the other end spoke again, lower this time, almost hesitant. I don't know what she's involved in. But whatever it is, it's big. And if you don't want to get caught up in it, you should walk away now. He should. He knew he should. But for the first time in years, he realized something terrifying. He wasn't sure if he could. His breath came slow and unsteady as he lowered the phone. The weight of what he had just heard pressed against his chest, heavy and suffocating. He had come here thinking he was just revisiting the past, maybe indulging in a little regret. But this was something else. He ran a hand through his hair, glancing back toward the venue. The flashes of cameras had dimmed, the crowd thinning as the night dragged on. She was still inside, probably in some exclusive after-party, surrounded by people who saw her as nothing more than a success story. They had no idea who she used to be. Or maybe they did. And they just didn't care. His phone vibrated again. A new message. If you're smart, you'll pretend you never called me. He stared at the screen, his mind racing. Every instinct told him to listen. To turn around, walk away, and forget he ever saw her again. But something inside him, something he couldn't quite name, wouldn't let him. Because if what he just heard was true, then this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something much bigger. His fingers tightened around the phone as another thought crept in, one that made his blood run cold. What if she wasn't ignoring her past by choice? What if she couldn't look back? His heart pounded. He needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. He had to see her. Alone. The thought sent a ripple of unease through him. The woman he had seen tonight wasn't the same person he once knew. She was something else now, someone powerful, untouchable. And yet, deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that if he got close enough, if he looked into her eyes, he'd see a trace of the person she used to be. And maybe, just maybe, he'd find out what really happened to her. He took a deep breath, pushing past the fear clawing at the back of his mind. Then, without giving himself a chance to reconsider, he turned and walked back toward the building, slipping past the last of the lingering photographers. If she had erased her past, he was about to find out why. He slipped through the side entrance, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. The music from the after-party pulsed through the walls, but the hallway he stepped into was quiet, empty. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he moved forward, each step careful, deliberate. He didn't belong here, but he didn't care. He had to see her. A part of him still believed this was just a coincidence, her rise to fame, the people disappearing, the eerie way she had looked right through him earlier. But another part, the part that refused to ignore the unease creeping up his spine, knew better. He rounded a corner and nearly stopped short. There she was. She stood near the end of the hallway, her back to him, speaking in hushed tones to a man he didn't recognize. She was different from the girl he once knew, but now, up close, he could see it even more. The way she carried herself, calm, composed, unreadable. He took a breath. Then, before he could talk himself out of it, he stepped forward. "We need to talk." She froze. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't turn. Then slowly, she faced him. Her expression didn't change. No surprise. No anger. Just quiet, unnerving calm. "There's nothing to talk about," she said. His chest tightened. "I know what's been happening," he pushed, his voice low. "The people disappearing. The past you've erased. This isn't just about moving on, is it?" Something flickered in her eyes, too quick for him to catch. She tilted her head slightly, watching him the way someone might watch a puzzle they weren't sure how to solve. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly. "Walk away. While you still can." The words sent a chill through him. "I can't do that." She exhaled, barely shaking her head like he was making a mistake she had already seen coming. The man beside her shifted, his gaze sharp, waiting. He could tell now, this wasn't some business associate or bodyguard. This was something else. "You always had to push, didn't you?" she murmured, more to herself than to him. He swallowed hard. "Tell me the truth. What happened to you?" She held his gaze for a long moment, then took a step closer. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, controlled. "You were right about one thing. I didn't just move on. I became something else. And once you see it, once you know you can't ever go back." His pulse hammered. "Then tell me. I want to know." Another beat of silence. Then, for the first time, her expression shifted. A trace of something almost sad. "No," she said. "You really don't." Before he could react, the man beside her moved. Fast. Too fast. A sharp pain exploded in the side of his head, and everything went dark. When he woke up, he was somewhere else. The air was cold, the walls unfamiliar. His head throbbed, and his vision blurred for a moment, before clearing just enough to see the figure standing in front of him. Her. But now, the unreadable mask was gone. For the first time that night, he saw the truth in her eyes. And it was nothing like he expected. His head pounded, his body sluggish as he forced himself upright. The room was dim, unfamiliar, the walls sleek and empty. He didn't know how long he'd been out, but the dull ache in his skull told him it hadn't been long. His breath was uneven as his eyes adjusted, landing on her. She stood a few feet away, watching him. But this time, there was no crowd, no flashing cameras, no forced distance between them. It was just the two of them. And yet, for the first time, he truly felt how far apart they were. "You shouldn't have come looking for me," she said softly. Her voice wasn't cold, but there was no warmth in it either. "I didn't have a choice," he murmured, his throat dry. "I had to know." She exhaled, crossing her arms. "And now that you do." His jaw tightened. "What happened to you? What did you get yourself into?" She hesitated, a flicker of something in her eyes. But just as quickly, it was gone. "You're asking the wrong question," she said. "You should be asking how you're going to leave here alive." A chill ran down his spine. "You wouldn't." "Not me," she interrupted. "But you don't understand what you've stepped into. There are things bigger than both of us now. People who don't care about what we used to be. People who only see you as a problem. He swallowed hard, then helped me understand. She studied him for a long moment. Then, quietly, she said, "You think I chose this life?" His breath caught. "Didn't you?" She shook her head. "I thought I was making a choice. I thought I was leaving the past behind, starting over. But you don't realize you're trapped until it's too late." His stomach twisted. "You're saying you can't leave?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a step closer, lowering her voice. "Do you remember what you said to me the last time we saw each other?" His mind flashed back to that night. The argument. The way they had walked away from each other, thinking it was the end. He barely recognized the people they had been back then. "I told you I didn't want to be part of your life anymore," he admitted. She nodded, something unreadable passing through her expression. "Well," she said, "you got what you wanted." His chest tightened. "That's not what I wanted." She sighed, running a hand through her hair, looking just for a moment like the girl he used to know. The one who dreamed big, but never lost herself in it. "I don't think I can fix this," she admitted. "I don't think I want to." His pulse quickened. "Then let me help you." She let out a bitter laugh. "You don't even know what you're offering." "I don't care," he shot back. "If you wanted me to walk away, you would have let them finish me off. But you didn't. That means something." She looked at him then, really looked at him. And for the first time, he saw it, the fear she had been hiding under all that control. She wasn't untouchable. She wasn't invincible. She was just someone who had gone too far and didn't know how to turn back. The silence stretched between them, thick with everything unsaid. Then slowly, she exhaled. "There's no going back to the way things were," she murmured. "I know." A beat of hesitation. Then, for the first time in years, she reached for his hand. "Then let's go." He didn't know where they were going, what came next, or if they even had a real shot at escaping whatever she was caught up in. But for now, none of that mattered. All that mattered was that, for the first time, she wasn't facing it alone.